Support comes from the Arizona Inn, a four-diamond, family-owned historic resort hotel and restaurant on Elm Street near the U of A. Information is at arizonainn.com.
Hello everyone, I'm Tucson Weekly senior writer Jim Ninsel, and we're here to talk Zona politics. Today we're once again highlighting the U of A College of Science Spring Lecture Series on climate change. Joining us in the studio is Joellen Russell, a U of A Associate Professor of Geosciences who specializes in studying the impacts of climate change on the world's oceans. Dr. Russell, welcome to Zona Politics.
Thanks for having me.
So what got you interested in studying the oceans?
I'm an odd duck. I grew up in an Eskimo fishing village 31 miles above the Arctic Circle on the Chukchi Sea, which is actually part of the Arctic Ocean. And being up there in a place where you're very isolated and nothing but big, broad horizons, I couldn't wait to be an explorer. And since I decided that all the land had been explored, there was nothing for it but to go to sea.
And these days, you're learning about the impacts of climate change on the oceans, and you've learned that the heat energy from the increased release of carbon in the atmosphere has really been sinking into the sea.
Absolutely.
What has been the impact of that?
Well, we've seen almost 93% of the energy imbalance that we measure at the top of the atmosphere. You know, we look out at the sun for how much is coming in. We look in at the Earth to see how much is actually making it back out to space. We see that the energy imbalance is growing every year. That energy imbalance has to go somewhere. And so what we've found by measuring it is that it's going into the ocean. 93% of the human-related greenhouse gas forced warming has gone into the ocean. And we see this in every ocean. We see it warming not just right at the surface, which you'd expect from the sun and then warmer atmosphere, but also it's mixing that heat all the way down to about 4 kilometers. And it's mixing it very specifically in the ocean around Antarctica.
And what does that do to the ocean?
Well, it does two things. One, it makes sea level higher because when you warm the water expands. And so in places like Massachusetts, you're seeing the surface current is warming and expanding the water, and then the deep current is warming and it's also expanding the water, giving you quite an abrupt pop-up in the sea level. But it also does other things. If in places where it's really warm near the surface, it tends to suppress actually the mixing because it takes more wind energy to mix away all that warm water that's deeper and deeper and deeper as it warms and warms and warms. And around Antarctica, we're actually seeing it warm all the way down to 4 kilometers, 4 kilometers. And that's actually doing a great thing for us here in Arizona, which is reducing the rate at which the atmosphere warms. It's still warming, but it's warming slightly less than it would normally because without all this ocean uptake of heat. And so I like to give a public interest talk that's called How the Antarctic is Helping Arizona Keep Its Cool.
And what's happening with the sea life? Is this having an impact on the sea life?
So the warming tends to do two things. One, if it suppresses the mixing, and it does this in many oceans around the world where it's not as vigorously mixed as around Antarctica, and what it does is that thick, warm layer of water makes it harder for the wind to push away the warm water and pull up to the surface the water that's cold and full of nutrients, plant food. That water, they strip it all out from the surface layer, and they need the wind to pull new water to the surface to feed the base of the food web for the global ocean, which is the phytoplankton that harvests the energy from the sun and turn it into all that lovely green that eventually becomes our fish.
So, and I think it's having a bad impact on things like coral too, right?
Well, now that's the tricky part. Is it's not the heat that's causing this problem. The problem is that all the CO2, when we burn anything, wood, coal, fossil fuels of any variety, oil, gas, et cetera, when we burn them, the byproduct is CO2. That's the combustion product. And so we see from all of our measurements in the atmosphere that it's going up, 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 up. We're over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere now. We haven't seen this for millions of years. And all that CO2, unfortunately, it is soluble in water. CO2 soluble. So what happens is it dissolves in the water and it forms a carbonic acid, a weak acid. So essentially, the more CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the more we're essentially titrating or acidifying the ocean. So we've actually observed that the pH in the ocean is dropping. And this, you would think, is not a big problem, except many of our tiny sea creatures, and bigger ones too, make their homes, their shells, out of calcium carbonate, which is the same thing you have in Tums or antacids, is you want to eat one of these and then you burp, right? Well, that's actually how when you put acid in the ocean, carbonic acid from CO2, you're acidifying the surface layer and deeper as it gets into the ocean. And the ones that are at risk are things like the base of the food web, like our coccolithophores, which are one of the most prevalent phytoplankton on planet Earth. They are all made out of they make their shells out of calcium carbonate, which it can be dissolved like a tum. And then things like reefs, coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef. Now, right now, they're sitting in warmer water, so it makes it less of a threat at the moment. But given the rate at which we're pumping out CO2, if we don't reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're essentially going to see in 50 to 100 years, the Great Barrier Reef will dissolve.
Yeah, you gave a talk, you led off the lecture series, and one of the things you said was if you're going to see the Great Barrier Reef or take your children, you better do it sooner than later.
Now, because it's not just that they dissolve, it's ragged. It will have harder time growing. The diversity may decrease because only the most robust, most hardy will survive. These are the sorts of things where if you want to see the Earth the way the ocean, the way she was meant to be seen, go now, go quickly, don't wait.
You know, the Joaquin Ruiz, the dean of the U of A College of Science, was on this program a few weeks ago, and he mentioned, you know, water is going to be the hammer of global warming, and it's definitely affecting our weather patterns. So westerly winds, you mentioned in your talk,
big deal.
Moving towards the poles. What is the impact of that?
So it's done two things. So we have these two big bands of westerlies in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere, and they're contracting toward the poles. I hate to say this, but kind of like a noose, getting tighter towards the poles. And this is partly the effect of our ozone holes that we ripped open with chlorofluorocarbons, freons from our fridges, et cetera. But it's also partly due to the fact that the lower atmosphere is warming because of all that extra CO2. So both effects, the cooling and the warming, are forcing those winds towards the poles. So the direct effect is that we get drier in southern Arizona. We're on the edge of where the westerlies can reach us. We normally get 3 to 5 storms. In bad years, it's 2 or 3, maybe. And those storms, when they reach us, that's what we get all our surface water, what we get our snow from, et cetera. So if the westerlies tilt towards the poles, we expect to get fewer storms making it all the way to us in southern Arizona. And that's a problem for many, many reasons, crops, agriculture, and other things being just the least of it. But we also have issues with, in the ocean, what that does is it changes what's stirred. So the ocean near the equator and in right next to the US on both sides gets stirred less. So in fact, because we've got less wind energy, because the winds have moved away, basically, making these big, huge gyres of warm water, basically the warm water thickens, which may decrease the total productivity in these whole areas right where our major fishing grounds are, on either side of the US. The same thing in the Southern Ocean is happening, except that it's all ocean down there until you get to the continent. So it's actually given us a little boost. And what it's done is by tightening nearer to Antarctica, because it pushes the water away in all directions away from Antarctica, these very intense winds and the Coriolis force, the water upwells, and it's upwelling from deeper and deeper, cold, rich, full of nutrients. Now, the bad part is it doesn't seem to be stimulating much additional growth, although we're not certain. We're going to wait for our floats to see how it happens. But because it's so dark during so much of the year when all this is happening, so it may not be stimulating growth, but at a minimum, it's bringing all this cold water to the surface, which is allowing it to take up additional heat and additional CO2.
You mentioned your floats, and we've got about 2 minutes left, so I didn't want to leave without talking about these floats, which is an amazing project. BGC Argo floats out there in the ocean. Tell us about these
So
things.
exciting. So the National Science Foundation has funded me, and I'm leading the modeling component. Lynn Talley at Scripps Institution of Oceanography is leading the observational component, and it's directed by Jorge Sarmiento at Princeton University. And what we're doing is we have it's called the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observations and Modeling. And the National Science Foundation has given us $21 million to do a combined project where we are deploying these profiling floats, autonomous robot floats that are making the measurements more every 5 days. They drop down to 2,000 meters, come all the way to the surface, making measurements of carbon, nutrients, oxygen, et cetera. And then they beam that data back by Iridium satellite, and we get it up on the web within 2 hours. And so a ship might take a few profiles along its distance, and it costs $40,000 a day, bare boat for a ship. These floats cost about $100,000, and they work for 5 years doing profiles every 5 to 10 days. We think we can transform our understanding of the ocean's sink for carbon by making these measurements.
And how many of them do you have out there?
Well, right now we've got 34, and we will have almost 200 out, and so it's very exciting. We've also just got an agreement with the 9 of the top 10 float deploying countries to actually build a global biogeochemical Argo array of these floats, so that with a global array, we can actually reduce the uncertainty in the amount of carbon going into the ocean, which will allow us to verify the carbon agreements that we've just come to in Paris at COP21 at the Conference of the Parties. So we have a carbon agreement. We've got new biogeochemical profiling floats. We're going to do carbon management. Here we go.
That's amazing. And they literally float around, they sink down, they rise up, they send the data to the satellite, and you get it.
And we put it online for the public, as well as using it for carbon management and other things.
Extraordinary work, and I want to learn more about it, hopefully once you get some more data coming in.
Oh, so excited.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Zona Politics. And we will be right back with author Catherine Ferguson.
Support for Zona Politics is provided by Hotel Congress in historic downtown Tucson. More information at hotelcongress.com and 622-8848.
The U of A Festival of Books returns in March, so we're talking with a few local authors over the next few weeks. Today, we're welcoming Catherine Ferguson, author of The Haunting of the Mexico Border. Catherine, welcome to Zona Politics.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
This book is about a lot of things. It's about your efforts to make a film down in Mexico, your work with the No More Deaths group to save border crossers in distress, and even your romance with an undocumented immigrant. Holding it all together, though, is really your love for Mexico. What attracts you so much to Mexico?
I was born in Tucson. They're our neighbors. We used to just run down there to buy coffee and beans and tortillas. And what I love about Mexico is the people.
And you spent a lot of time in the Sierra Madre with Tarahumara to make a film.
I did.
Tell us how you ended up down there and why you decided to make a movie about them.
I ended up there because I was lost. I was with a friend. We were driving around out in the Sierra, in the mountains, and we just were sightseeing. And then we were very lost, and there was an old gentleman, a Raramuri Indian, and we asked if we could throw our sleeping bags down on his property. And he said, yeah, come on. And he got in the car, and that was it. He was my friend forever.
And how did you get involved with the No More Deaths group?
I got involved with No More Deaths at the beginning, and then with the Tucson Samaritans. And over the years, since I'm from here, I would hear about all the deaths in the desert. And I thought, how can I possibly do anything on one individual? And then I heard about these organizations, and I went to see what they were like, and I liked them. And
what was it like to be out in the desert with them?
Life-changing.
How so?
Oh, life-changing. Honestly, when you're in the desert, I was in the desert for 12 years. I worked out there. And you carry backpacks full of water and food and medicine. And every day you're walking, looking for people, and you're calling out in Spanish. You yell out, oh, are you here? Is there anybody here? We have food and water. We're friends. And then suddenly somebody steps out in front of you, and you're just shocked. I mean, you're looking for people, you really don't expect to find them, and then there's somebody there, and that person has a history, a story, where they came from, why on earth would they be in the middle of the Arizona-Sonora desert. And it's always shocking. It's immediate when you talk to them. It's kind of like being in a war. There's nothing extraneous. It's just like, bam, you get right to the heart of that person.
And how were your interactions with the Border Patrol out there?
It's varied. It's varied. There are some gentlemen out there that do a good job, and there are a lot of men out there that don't want to be there. They work long, hard hours, and they're bored, and they look for any kind of adventure they can have, and they're not so nice to deal with.
And you were arrested at one point as part of your work with No More Deaths. It's a pretty harrowing tale in the book here. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I had been out in the morning with a woman and her 9-year-old son, and we were out looking to encounter people to take food and water out if we could find anybody that was in need in the desert. We stopped for lunch, and a unmarked truck pulled up behind us. And they sat there for a while, and then we ended up asking them why they were there, and they jumped out of their vehicle and asked strange questions, and then quickly one man hit me and then handcuffed me, and so it was about a year of lawyers in court, and then they dropped the charges. And
you ended up down in a small town, no ride home, no.
Yes, I was in that. After I was handcuffed and let go, they were going to just leave me in the desert. So it was quite an adventure.
Oh my goodness gracious! Do you talk much with the refugees coming here from Central America?
Yes, with some of them, it's a terrible situation. It goes back to the 80s when the United States was in El Salvador. We gave $5 billion to some dictatorships there, and it seems that this is a result. Now there's a lot of crime, and we see lots of those kids coming across the border.
Yeah, what are they telling you? They're in fear of their life from the gangs down there?
Yeah, they're terrified. They don't talk too much. They are so scared, and it's a long, terrible, terrible journey. And they're escaping. Their parents have sent them. They've come on their own. It's frightening.
It must take a lot to put your child on a train and send them across several countries in hopes of a better life in the United States.
Can you imagine? I can't imagine doing that.
The conditions there must be just absolutely terrifying for the children who are either being inducted into these gangs or threatened with rape or what have you.
Yes, otherwise there's no reason you would do that.
Right. So you're going to be at the Festival of Books.
Yes.
I'll be moderating a panel with you.
I know, I'm so excited.
Yeah, Margaret Regan will be on it.
I know, wonderful.
What are we talking about?
We're talking about women on the border, women journalists on the border, stories that women tell on the border. So I think that'll be pretty interesting. It's a woman's point of view of this great, wonderful U.S.-Mexico border.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it. We'll be right back with author Margaret Regan.
Support for Zona Politics is provided by Maynard's Market across from Hotel Congress in historic downtown. Maynard's Market serves breakfast and lunch, while Maynard's Kitchen serves dinner and brunch. Maynard's Market features happy hour from 4 to 8 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and Maynard's Fall Wine Tasting takes place Fridays from 6 to 8 p.m. Menu details and more information at maynardstucson.com or 545-0577.
My longtime colleague Margaret Regan will be among the authors at this year's Festival of Books. Last year, I talked with Margaret about her new book, Detained and Deported, Stories of Immigrant Families Under Fire, which is an in-depth look at the often heartbreaking tales of undocumented immigrants who get caught up in the legal system. Here's a second look at that interview. Joining me on the set is Margaret Regan. Margaret is a longtime colleague of mine at the Tucson Weekly, where she has won dozens of journalism awards for her reporting, feature writing, and arts criticism. She's also the author of 2 books on immigration. The first was The Death of Jocelyn, that examined the perilous trip that many undocumented immigrants set out on when they crossed the Arizona desert, often with tragic results. Her second book is Detained and Deported, just being released this week. It's about what happens when an undocumented immigrant ends up in custody. Margaret, thank you for joining me here on Zona Politics.
I'm thrilled to be here, Jim.
Now, a lot of the time the immigration debate is about these political battles in Washington or rhetoric on the campaign trail, but your work has really been praised for finding the human face of these people.
Right.
Well, what draws you to these stories?
Well, you know, these are human beings. As you say, we hear about this all the time, the numbers of people doing this and that, the numbers of people, you know, that ought to be deported, ought to be detained. But we don't look at what happens to a family when, say, the mom gets arrested and is put in the detention center and the children end up in foster care or worse. So I think it's really important to introduce ourselves to people who are really undergoing these tragic things, their individual lives that are really upended.
And there's a story in your book about a woman named Yolanda. She ends up dragged into a sex trafficking ring, ends up being detained. She's separated from her children. And her story is horrific, but it has a bit of a happy ending. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, like many of these very poor and powerless immigrant women, she was abused by a partner. That's one of the things that was kind of the most disturbing thing I learned about an American citizen partner who was safe. He abused her so much, she fled the home. She got caught up in this sex trafficking ring. She couldn't get out. They threatened her life. They threatened the lives of her children. But eventually she gets arrested and she's charged with prostitution and convicted. So now she's a felon. So she's sent to the detention center. The kids are left with the abusive boyfriend. She's in the detention center for 2 years and hardly ever sees these children. There's never been any indication that she's a bad mother. By contrast, a loving, devoted mother. And these are very young children, under the age of 6 who need their mom. She had a happy ending only because a lawyer in Tucson, a U of A law professor, Nina Rabin, became aware of her case and fought and fought and fought for her. And ultimately, she was able to get her a T visa, which is given to women, or I guess young men also, who've been hauled into sex trafficking operations, and it grants them permanent residency in the United States. So it's a good point that she happened to get out of the detention center at Eloy, which is the great big detention center here in Arizona, solely because she had a lawyer, but these people are not entitled to free legal counsel.
And yeah, talk a little bit about your visits to these detention centers. You say, they're not really supposed to be prisons per se, but
Right.
they sure seem like they are.
Oh yeah, I mean, I went up there to visit Yolanda one day, a couple years ago now, and I was shocked at the treatments of the family. They only have visiting days on Saturday and Sunday, and again, these people are not being detained. Once they're in Eloy, they're just being detained for immigration reasons, not for criminal reasons. So yes, it's not a prison. They had a whole herd, maybe 100 family members stuck in this lobby, the guards yelling at them, the guards yelling at the kids. Little kids who are going there to see their mom that they've been separated from, or their dad. Very rude to everybody. The children, the mom, the parents, whoever is bringing the children, they're not allowed to bring in food or activities for the kids. You see a lot of tears among the little children. And that's just the visiting, all the reports I have from the detainees. The food is horrible. They have trouble getting access to medical care. And Eloy, unfortunately, has high rates of death, higher than many of the other detention centers in the United States.
And these detention centers, it's a fairly isolated spot for people to
Yeah.
even try to get to visit to.
Right, by design, I believe. Eloy is halfway between Phoenix and Tucson, and it's well off the road from I-10, so you and I don't see it driving up there. You get off the road at Eloy and you go in 8 miles and you see this gigantic prison block. And it makes it very difficult. Yolanda, for her to visit her children, she had to get a relative or a friend to pick up those kids, and it was a 3 or 4 hour round trip for them to bring them down to see her on a Sunday, and it didn't happen very often.
And these are private facilities, private prisons. What did you learn about the Corrections Corporation of America as you researched this book?
Well, the Corrections Corporation of America, which runs Eloy for profit, under contract with ICE, the federal government, is a thriving industry. They make millions of dollars every year just from their detention centers. And it's interesting, there is an ICE detention facility in Florence that's much better run, much more friendly towards families, visits 7 days a week. And this is the same government that contracts out to a place like the Corrections Corporation of America, which has, developed this reputation for very harsh treatment of the immigrants. And yet they make a tidy profit every day from incarcerating people like Yolanda. And the thing about private detention prisons is the harsher our immigration laws get, the more people we detain, the more money they make.
And there's a new one opening up in Texas very soon to
Yeah.
handle the Central American refugees.
Absolutely, all those women and children that we heard so much about last summer. The Obama administration has decided to really crack down on those people who are usually very vulnerable people escaping violence, and especially the gangs. And Central America is very crime and drug ridden. These people are really refugees, but they've made the decision to incarcerate women, children, and babies in this large new detention center in Texas. And guess who got the contract? Corrections Corporation of America. And they're doubling their fee for handling women and children. It's going to be close to $300 a day, more than double what they're getting in Eloy.
And you first started writing about the border in 2000, I remember, the Tucson Weekly. What got you interested in sinking into this topic?
Well, you may recall a staff meeting at the Tucson Weekly we had in the year 2000. That was the year that for the first time we kept hearing about migrant deaths in the desert. We're so used to them now, we think it must always have been the case that people have been dying in the desert in Arizona. It's not the case. It really didn't start until the late 90s, early 2000s. And it was because of federal policy, we sealed off the easier, safer urban crossings at El Paso and San Diego So where did the people go? They went to the treacherous territory in between, which is Arizona. So starting after, Operation Gatekeeper and the other federal programs, they started coming through here. Year 2000, we really first started hearing about the deaths for the first time. And I remember being at a staff meeting at the Tucson Weekly, and I said, you guys, we got to cover this. We're the long form newspaper closest to the border in Arizona. It's our responsibility. And you, and probably our editor at the time, said, well, why don't you do it? We're always shifting responsibilities around. And I hadn't thought of myself as being the person, because I mostly covered arts, but I was thrilled to do it, and I went down to Douglas, Arizona, which in those days was the migrant crossing, and that was a life-changing experience to see those hundreds and hundreds of people in the jail down there.
And you came across a deceased immigrant even in that process and ended up writing about him.
That's right. Right. When I went down there with Hector Acuna, our former colleague, the photographer, and we learned that a migrant had died in the desert that day, and they had taken the young man's cousin into custody. And his name was Ishmael, and the young man who died was named Silverio, and I had the opportunity to interview Ishmael in the Border Patrol headquarters there. And it was the first time that I talked to, he was a Guatemalan indigenous man, Spanish not his native language. First time I really talked to an immigrant about the long, difficult, and what I consider heroic journey all the way up from Guatemala to the Arizona desert with the sole purpose of earning enough money to support his 4 little children. So that was a very life-changing event for me, and after that story, that's what I wanted to write about more than anything else.
And you see echoes in the stories of immigrants coming from Latin America today or elsewhere, and your own heritage with the Irish more than a century ago.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. A few months before I went down to Douglas, I had written a big story about my own Irish ancestry. My father had died the year before, and in grieving his death, I wanted to write about him and where he had come from, what his roots were. And I had done a lot of research into the tragedy of the Irish immigration to the United States in the mid-19th century, following on the famine. And my own family had a very tragic story. My father's grandparents died quite young. His own father was left orphaned on the streets of Philadelphia, basically raised himself, just kind of abandoned by society. And as you know, in those days, no Irish need apply signs were the order of the day. And I went down to Douglas, and I had a long drive home just thinking about it all, and I thought to myself, this is the same story. I just wrote about my father and where he came from and my own ancestors and how badly they fared in America at the beginning. And this is the same story. These are immigrants of today. And we've had wave after wave after wave of immigration in the United States. And we're so proud of being an immigrant nation. But every time a new wave of people come in, we treat them badly and we handle the situation badly. So I think it's important to point that out.
Zona Politics is a proud media partner of the Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which serves the business community in the bilingual, bicultural region of the Arizona-Sonora border. For more information, visit TucsonHispanicChamber.org or call 620-0005.
That's our show for today. Next week, we'll talk with another U of A scientist about ways to use alternative energy to reduce carbon emissions and fight climate change. And we'll talk with more authors who will be attending the Tucson Festival of Books. My thanks to our media partners at Tucson Weekly, Tucson Local Media, and KXCI 91.3 FM, where you can hear the show at 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoons. If you missed any part of today's show, you can find all our episodes at zonapolitics.com, and be sure to follow us on Facebook. I'm Jim Ninsel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Support for this program generously provided by Charles A. Levy. Support comes from Brink Media, Arizona's most politically aware creative agency.
Zona Politics is hosted by Tucson Weekly senior writer Jim Ninsel. The program is produced by Jim Ninsel, Jennifer Powers Murphy, and Danny Vinnick, and edited by Jim Rundle. Sound engineering by Craig Schumacher and Chris Schultz of Wavelab Studios. Special thanks to KXCI, Tucson Weekly, CW Tucson, Brink Creative Digital, and all supporters who provide crucial funding for the program.